Viktor Alexeyevich, in the previous programs, we considered 5 of 6 priorities of the system of supranational governance, conceptual power: military weapons, means of genocide, alcohol, tobacco, drugs, world money, ideological and chronological priorities. Today, we will consider the remaining, the most important of them in significance.
Yes. Above these 5 priorities, there is the most powerful in terms of stability of achievable results, worldview methodological priority. All the priorities of conceptual power are internested, but the results are obtained through their simultaneous impact on society. On the worldview priority, this or that world understanding, that is, the view on the world in a lexical form, objectives of development, conception of governance, takes shape. Such world understanding can be set out in books, the Bible, the Quran, but it can also be present at the unconscious levels of the psyche, being reflected only in folk epics and songs, traditions and raviousness of society. The conception, dead water, generalizes the information stored in the collective unconscious of our people and brings it to the level of consciousness. Russia thereby declares to the world that it has its own conception of development in the 3rd millennium, presented in clear lexical forms.
And what is the basis of world understanding?
The basis of world understanding is bloodline genetics, unconscious levels of the psyche. However, when brought onto the level of consciousness, this basis can be significantly deformed by the dominant conception in society, the information matrix, inadequate to the genetics of the people. We all know how in the printing industry, during the mechanical processing of materials, one or another product is produced, depending on the matrix used. It is the matrix that forms the image, the structural organization of the future product. The conception is also a matrix, but used in relation to human material. The nascent generation, not always realizing this, turns out to be placed in an information matrix, a conception, and by the age of 15, 20, bypassing their will, acquires the qualities necessary for the owners of this conception. Not a single child has a need for alcohol from birth. However, celebrating the end of school, in our reality, only a few refrain from drinking alcoholic beverages on this occasion. The actively imposed stereotypes are triggered. This also happens in any other questions concerning the formation of the worldview as a whole.
One cannot but agree with you that the worldview is purpose-orientedly formed, but can it really have an impact on the well-being of the people? Because it is precisely the well-being that is regarded by many as the result of governance.
In our stereotypes, we have no idea that it is the worldview that shapes global social tendencies for centuries and millennia, including well-being in particular. I was most clearly convinced of this in India. In this country, you can see a terrifying scene. Up to 300 million people, along ditches and roads, drag out a bestial existence in the full sense of the word, having no housing, no work, no food, to say nothing of any sanitary conditions. A similar picture is in South Africa. So these creatures have a special worldview. In India they are called little people, and they consider it a norm for themselves. They do not even have a desire to change something. They are content with scraps and a crust of bread thrown from a passing car by the big man. They will never change either their way of life or their well-being unless a new world understanding, a new view on the world and their place in it, arises in their midst. We observed a different worldview in Switzerland, where in a conversation with one of the initiates, it became clear that he perceives everyone around him as draft working animals. In accordance with this worldview of slavery, he builds relationships with the surrounding world. Of course, the third variant is also possible, the variant of equal human relations. It is these very relations that our team stands for. For us, it is unacceptable to build the well-being of the country at the expense of other people's. But also unacceptable is the situation when someone parasitizes on our dobriousness and openness, on our raw material and energy resources.
Viktor Alexeyevich, and which countries are rising to the comprehending of the worldview as an instrument of governance, to the comprehending of conceptual power?
There are only 4, not state, however, but interregional centers of governance: the Euro-American conglomerate, the biblical conception of governance, headquarters in Switzerland, the Quranic East, the Buddhist East, Rus as a special civilization. The peculiarity of Russian civilization is that in it, unlike all others, the boundaries of statehood at certain stages coincide with the civilizational ones. Well, of course, when we talk about Russian civilization, we are not talking about a nationality, but about a measure of nraviousness, about worldview, about the state of soul. It is no coincidence that we call Ethiopian Pushkin the great Russian poet, and for example the painter Isaac Levitan the great Russian painter. At the unconscious levels of the psyche, the schemes of the functioning of conceptual power, the internestings of its priorities, were fixed by Russian civilization in such toys as the matryoshka, the Russian nesting doll. In ancient Egypt, these schemes were reflected in internestings of sarcophagi. Each encompassing doll unambiguously limits the freedom of action of those input in it. That is, everything is possible inside, from fascism to pseudo-communism, but within the framework of a certain doll, in line with a certain conception.
And how to relate towards the conception worked out by your team? How can one use it in order to understand the interrelationship between the superpowers?
We know that our information is being studied in detail. Our website, vodaspb.ru, is actively visited not only in our country, but practically all over the world. In 1995, the right to translate our materials into Chinese was formalized, and we know about the special attitude towards the materials in the United States. Now I will say what cannot but rouse the interest of the special services and the leadership of these countries. The system of biblical supranational governance, the global predictor, builds its game on the basis of strategic manipulations with three superpowers. It is easier to organize two against the third. Until 1960, friendship between Russia and China against the United States was organized. Since the 1960s, the USA and China were friends against Russia. Now Russia is consciously egressing from this vicious confrontation. Our president has risen in the measure of understanding above the scriptwriters programming the conflict. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer, for how else can you find out about their intentions, says the not accessible to all wisdom. The global predictor convulsively provokes Russia into a global conflict with the USA, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Georgia. Our team is not aware of a single more or less plausible version of the destruction of the Kursk nuclear submarine, except for the version of the destruction intended for these purposes by NATO military means. The presidential structures of our country seem to have comprehended this scenario and withstood this provocation, and they are skillfully avoiding being involved in a military conflict. But the US leadership simply amazes with its conceptual incompetence, digging a pit for its own people according to the scheme of Germany in the 1930s. We have already pointed out this analogy. The scheme of using the USA as a kamikaze puppet was announced by Y.M. Lushkov in Moskovsky Komsomolets newspaper on May the 19th. At the egregorial matrix level, our team strives to destroy these scenarios' matrices of the collapse of the USA, implemented from the supranational level of governance. The prepared catastrophic future of the USA is unacceptable for Russia and the dobro-nravious part of humanity.
Viktor Alexeyevich, speaking about the formation of a worldview, it would be wrong to ignore the issues concerning the Church, faith towards God.
You are absolutely right. But for us, faith towards God and the ritual with the candle in the church are very distant, incompatible with each other. Faith towards God for us is the fundamental facet of the worldview, which by and large can be either God-centric or I-centric, in which there is no place for God. In the first case, you will form a mosaic, holistic, interconnected view on creation and everything that takes place in it. In the case of the I-centric worldview, the world will appear before you like in a kaleidoscope, as a set of meaningless, random, not connected with each other phenomena and events. The truth, hidden from the uninitiated part of humanity, is concluded in the fact that in creation there exists God, the Creator, the Almighty, one for all living on earth. Faith towards Him is incompatible with belonging to any church hierarchy. This belief is outside of confessional in character. The lie about the absence of true God, the Creator, the Almighty, is broken into two lies: materialistic atheism since 1917, and idealistic atheism until 1917. Idealistic atheists, these are churches of all stripes. They claim that there is God, but for some this is Jesus Christ, for others this is Allah, and for others still this is Buddha, etc. And for what? The fact is that all wars on earth are organized by initiated pseudo-jretzes precisely on the basis that some people have been fed with one faked God, others with another one, and on this basis they push people into war. If people understand that God is one for all countries and peoples, then it will no longer be possible to pit them against one another in war. In reality, intellect in creation is hierarchical and discrete. There is mineral life, plant life, animal life. Man in this hierarchy is not the crown of intellect in creation. Above the level of man's reason and intellect stands the highest reason, if we use the terminology of the Holy Rus Jretzhud. One can put a sign of equality and say God. It is not the term that is important, but views concerning this phenomenon. But just as a plant cannot have views on an animal, so man is not given at the level of reason to understand what God is.
But how, in your understanding, can one form an idea about God or understand the manifestations of His essence?
God gives ideas on Himself strictly individually, just as much as a person believes Him. God answers the prayer of the believer who turns to Him, and answers with the language of life circumstances, changing the statistics of accidents happening to the believer. A prayer is a meaningful appeal to the highest reason, directly in one's own words. Accidents will turn into favorable events if one does something in the stream of God's providence, or into oppressing events if one does something that contradicts God's providence. Only a non-oppressed psyche is capable of fixing these cause-effect conditionalities and thereby entering into a direct dialogue with God. Those who consume alcohol or tobacco do not have this gift. If a person tries to appeal to God through middlemen brokers, through the church, then the system of magical rituals performed by the church forms in him erroneous feelings of connection with God. But in fact, these are connections with so-called egregorial levels, with energy information formations formed by the mental manifestations of people. In other words, in the church, there is a substitution of concepts, and therefore, the further a person is from the church, from the pseudo-God constructed by the earthly hierarchy, the closer he is to true God, the Creator, the Almighty.
But how to explain that different scriptures are given to different peoples?
It is necessary to distinguish the revelations given from above, if you like, from one center, one in content and their reflections in written form. If one puts the Bible, the Quran, Buddhism, the encoded revelations of A.S. Pushkin on one table, and if one studies them dobrosoveschly, cleanses them from malicious distortions and perversions, then it is impossible not to notice that one deals with one testament sent from above. It is impossible not to notice that Buddha, Jesus Christ, and Muhammad, as well as other prophets, taught people the same thing. The only difference is that their oral revelations are distorted in different ways in later scriptures. With reason instead of the rigorous dogma of theologians, it is not difficult to distinguish and understand the distortions. It is impossible, for example, not to notice that the Bible, the Book of Isaiah, and the Wisdom of Solomon provide information about two fundamentally different gods. If you look closely at what evil is done under the cover of Allah, and properly read the Quran, then it will become clear to you how far the historical Islam is from what is written in the Quran, from what Muhammad taught. In order to destroy the integrity, the holism of perception by Russian-speaking readers, the surahs of the Quran are given in a completely different sequence in relation to how they were revealed to Muhammad. And in Arabic, the word Allah was left without translation, although in Russian there is an exact translation of this word, God, and it turns out that Muslims supposedly have some kind of God of their own. As for the deceptive deification of Jesus Christ, this was done in 325 AD at the First Nicaean Council, when by a simple majority vote, Jesus Christ was, contrary to common sense, proclaimed as God. The future of our country is in true Christianity, which Jesus Christ preached as the endeavor to live according to truth, pravda. The purpose of our program is to provide information to radio listeners about the presence of fundamentally different views on the issue of God and the possibilities of direct contacts with Him without churches and other middlemen brokers who make money on this. A systemic presentation of these questions can be found in our books. Questions to Metropolitan of St. Petersburg and Ladoga John and the Hierarchs of the Russian Orthodox Church, Faith and Measure, Dialectics and Atheism, Two Essences Incompatible, The Master and Margarita, A Hymn to Demonism, or The Gospel of Selfless Faith, and a number of other works. So, it is no longer possible to fool Russian civilization further by virtue of the revealed by us earlier law of time. The worldview of either slaves or slave owners, as well as godlessness of all stripes, is unacceptable for our people. Russia will go on the course towards diocracy. To reimpose on us the lies of idealistic atheism will not work. One cannot hatch the same egg twice, as was said by Kosma Prutkov.